Hey guys, we are back with the last two chapters of Mr. Popper's Penguins. I hope you guys have really enjoyed the book. Let's review just very quickly. Remember, in the last two chapters we read 17 and 18. 17 was called Fame, and this is when the birds are really getting famous. They were traveling all over the country, doing shows, doing their acts, and really getting very popular. They ended up also causing a little bit of confusion when they were on the stage and they were going and watching other performers do their acts, and they would actually be on the stage, and the other performers didn't like that because they felt like they were getting, or the attention was given to the birds and not to them for their act. There was one whenever the penguins ended up having to be shooed off the stage, and they ended up coming out of the orchestra pit, that area right in front of them, and again, the people loved it. Mr. Popper was like, I don't know if I should go in there. That's not my area, but yet this is your birds. You should probably go up there, right? You should probably go get them out. So, and then chapter 18 was called April Winds, and that was when they went to New York City, and it was very hot. So it was during the summer. It was very hot. Penguins were not happy. They were really kind of just mentally getting done with all of this whole performing thing. They were over it. So thankfully it was one of their, it was getting close to the end of their 10 weeks, but they still had to do their performance, and there was a bunch of confusion about the theater, and they ended up going to the wrong theater and having the police come. They had a little instance with some seals. Remember the seals? And then the seals were wearing the policeman's caps, and then the penguins were wearing the fireman's caps. So it was just a big hoopla, but the owner at the Royal Theater where they were was not happy, ended up calling the police because of it. So chapter 19, I just had it, hold on. Okay, chapter 19, Admiral Drake. So Mr. Popper with Captain Cook, Greta, Columbus, Louisa, Nelson, Jenny, Magellan, Adelina, Scott, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria was bundled into the patrol wagon and hustled off to the police station. That theater manager is pretty mad at the way you busted into his theater, so I'm holding you. I'm going to give you all a nice quiet cell, unless you furnish bail. I'm putting the bail at $500 for you and $100 for each of your birds. Of course, Mr. Popper did not have that much money about him, neither did Mrs. Popper when they telephoned her at the hotel. The hotel bill was paid for several days ahead, but she had no cash. The check for the final week's salary was not due until the end of the week. Indeed, it now looked as if the Poppers would never see that check, since they could not get the penguins out of jail long enough to put on their act at the Royal Theater. If only they could have gotten into touch with Mr. Greenbaum, Mr. Popper knew that kind man would have them out. But Mr. Greenbaum was somewhere in Hollywood, out on the Pacific coast, and the Poppers had no idea how to reach him. It was very dull for the birds in jail. Wednesday came, and there was still no word from Mr. Greenbaum. Thursday, and the birds began to droop. It was soon apparent that the lack of exercise, combined with the heat, might prove too much for them. There were no more tricks or merry games. Even the younger birds sat all day in dismal silence, and Mr. Popper could not cheer them up. So here they are, sitting in their gel cell. Poor little birds, not very happy. Mr. Popper had a feeling that Mr. Greenbaum would probably turn up by the end of the week to see about renewing the contract, but Friday passed without any news from him. Saturday morning, Mr. Popper got up very early and smoothed his hair. Then he dusted off the penguins as well as he could, for he wanted everything to look as presentable as possible in case Mr. Greenbaum should appear. About 10 o'clock, there was a sound of footsteps in the corridor and a jingling of keys, and the door of the cell was open. You're free, Mr. Popper. There's a friend of yours here. Mr. Popper stepped out into the light with the penguins. You're barely in time, Mr. Greenbaum, he was about to say. But then as his eyes became accustomed to the light, he looked again. Who could it be? It was not Mr. Greenbaum who stood there. It was a great bearded man in a splendid uniform, smiling. He held out his hand to Mr. Popper. Mr. Popper, he said, I am Admiral Drake. Admiral Drake? gasped Mr. Popper. Not back from the South Pole? Yes, said the Admiral. The Drake Antarctic expedition ship returned yesterday. You should have seen the reception New York gave us. You can read about it in today's paper. But I read about the trouble you were having over the penguins, so here I am. I have a long story to tell you. Could we go to the hotel and talk about it? Asked Mr. Popper. My wife will be very anxious to see us back. Certainly, said the Admiral. And when they were all settled in the Popper rooms at the hotel, with the penguins clustering around to listen, Admiral Drake began his story. Naturally, when I knew that I was coming back to America, I often thought about the man to whom I had sent the penguin. It takes us a long time to hear things down there, and I often wondered how you and the bird were getting along. Last night, the mayor's... Sorry, guys, 1 second. Jetta, brown paper. Sorry. Okay. Okay. It takes a long time for us to hear things down here, and I often wondered how you and the bird were getting along. Last night, at the mayor's dinner for us, I heard about the wonderful trained penguin act you had been putting on all over the country. This morning, I picked up the paper, and the first thing I read was that Mr. Popper and his 12 penguins were still being held in jail. But 12 penguins? Mr. Popper, how on earth? Then Mr. Popper told how Greta had arrived to keep Captain Cook from being lonely, and how the little penguins had grown, and how the clever little band had saved the day for the Poppers when things looked really bad. It's amazing, said Admiral Drake. I've seen a lot of penguins in my time, but never such educated ones as these. It certainly shows what patience and training can do. But now to get to my real point, Mr. Popper, you probably know that I have explored the North Pole as well as the South Pole, yes? Oh, yes, said Mr. Popper respectfully. I have read both of your books about your Arctic and your Antarctic expeditions. Well then, said the Admiral, maybe you know why we as explorers prefer the South Pole? Well, could it be on account of the penguins, sir? Asked Janie, who had been listening very carefully. Admiral Drake patted her head. Yes, my dear, those long polar nights get pretty dull when you have no pets to play with. Of course, there are polar bears up there, but you can't play with them. Nobody knows why there are no penguins at the North Pole. For a long time, the United States government had been wanting me to lead an expedition up there for the purpose of establishing a breed of penguins. I must come to the point, Mr. Popper. You've had such remarkable success with the birds of yours. Why not let me take them to the North Pole and start a race of penguins there? Well, just then, Mr. Greenbaum and another gentleman were announced. They shook hands all around and were introduced to the Admiral. Well, Popper, said Mr. Greenbaum, too bad about the mix-up at the theaters, but never mind. Here's Mr. Klein, who owns the colossal film company. He's going to make your fortune. You'll be a poor man no longer, Mr. Popper. Poor, said Mr. Popper. I'm not poor. These birds have been earning us $5,000 a week. Oh, $5,000, said Mr. Klein. What's that? Pin money? I want to put these birds in the movies, Mr. Popper. We've got the story department working on stories for them already. Well, I'll put each one of these birds under a contract that will keep you and the missus on Easy Street for the rest of your lives. Papa, whispered Mrs. Popper, I don't want to live on Easy Street. I want to go back to Proudfoot Avenue. Better consider, Mr. Popper. I can't offer you anything like that, said the Admiral. You say those men at the North Pole get lonely because there are no penguins? Asked Mr. Popper. Very lonely, said the Admiral. But if there were penguins up there, mightn't the polar bears eat them? Oh, ordinary penguins, yes, said the Admiral, jestingly. But not such highly trained birds as yours, Mr. Popper. They could outwit any polar bear, I would guess. It was now Mr. Klein's turn to speak. In every moving picture house in America, little children had the pleasure of seeing stories acted by Popper's performing penguins, he said. Of course, if we succeeded in establishing the breed at the North Pole, said the Admiral, the name might have to be changed just a little. I imagine that hundreds of years from now, the scientists would be calling them the Popper Arctic penguins. Mr. Popper was silent for a moment. Gentlemen, he said, I want to thank you both. I'll give you my decision tomorrow. So now he's got to decide, is he going to send these penguins with the Admiral, or is he going to put them in the movies and get a lot of money? Okay, what would you do? I don't know. I feel like I would send him with the Admiral. That's just me. Okay, let's see. Chapter 20. Farewell, Mr. Popper. It was a long, hard decision to make. Long after the visitors had gone, Mr. and Mrs. Popper sat and discussed what was best for everybody. Mrs. Popper could see the advantages of both offers, and she pointed these out without trying to influence him. I feel that the penguins are really your responsibility, she said, and you must make up your mind. It was a pale and haggard Mr. Popper who was ready to announce his decision the next day. Mr. Klein, he said, I want you to know how much I appreciate your offer of putting my birds in the movies, but I am afraid that I have to refuse. I do not believe the life in Hollywood would be good for any of those penguins. Then he turned to Admiral Drake. Admiral Drake, I am going to give you the birds. In doing this, I am considering the birds first of all. I know that they have been comfortable and happy with me. Lately, though, with the excitement and the warm weather, I've been very worried about them. The birds have done so much for me that I have to do what is best for them. After all, they belong in a cold climate. And then I can't help being sorry for those men up at the North Pole without any penguins just to help them pass the time. Your government will thank you, Mr. Popper, answered the Admiral. Congratulations, Admiral, said Mr. Klein. Maybe you're right about that, Popper. Hollywood might have been too much for those birds. I wish you'd let me make one short movie with them here in New York, though, before they go. Just some pictures of the sort of thing they do on the stage, you know. We'd show the film everywhere with an announcement that these are the famous Popper penguins that are being taken to the North Pole by Admiral Drake of the United States Arctic Penguin Foundation Expedition. Or, you know, something like that. Well, I'd like that very much, said Mr. Popper. We'd pay you, of course, continued Mr. Klein, not a fortune, as we would have if you let us give them a contract, but say $25,000? Well, we sure could use it, said Mrs. Popper. It will be a very quiet at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, said Mr. Popper, when everyone had left. Mrs. Popper did not answer. She knew that nothing she could say could really comfort him. However, said Mr. Popper, now that it is spring here, a lot of people will be wanting their houses painted, so we better be getting back. Anyway, said Bill, we've had a whole 10 weeks of vacation right in the middle of the year, and not very many children in Stillwater can say that. All right, so here he is with the Admiral and Mr. Klein giving him his decision. I think he made a good choice. The next day, the cameraman arrived to make the picture of the penguins doing their tricks. It was arranged that the Poppers should stay in New York just long enough to see the expedition off. Meanwhile, in the harbor, the great sailing ship of Admiral Drake was being made ready for its long trip north. Every day, huge boxes of supplies of all sorts were hustled on board. The most comfortable quarters on the ship were turned over to the penguins, who were the cause of the voyage. Captain Cook was already quite familiar with the ship, since it was the same one the Admiral had sailed on to the South Pole, where Captain Cook had often seen it. Greta, too, had seen vessels of its kind. The two of them were kept very busy showing and explaining everything to the younger Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria. The sailors all took the greatest delight in watching the curious little birds at their explorations. It looks as if this will be a pretty lively trip, they would say. These Popper penguins certainly live up to their reputation. But at last, everything was ready for the day when the Poppers were to go down and say goodbye. Bill and Janie ran all over the ship and did not want to leave when it was time to draw up the gangplank. The Admiral shook hands with them and Mrs. Popper and thanked them for having helped to train the extraordinary penguins that were there to be a real contribution to science. Mr. Popper had gone down below to say a private farewell to his birds. All that kept him from breaking down completely was the knowledge that what he was doing was best for them too. First he said goodbye to all the younger penguins, and then to Greta, who had saved Captain Cook. Then, last of all, he leaned over and said a special goodbye to Captain Cook, who had come and made life so different for Mr. Popper. Then he wiped his eyes, straightened his back, and went up on the deck to say goodbye to Admiral Drake. So here he is saying his goodbyes. Goodbye, Admiral Drake, he said. Goodbye, repeated the Admiral. Why, what do you mean? Aren't you coming with me? Me? To the North Pole? Why, yes, you, of course, Mr. Popper. But how could I go with you? I'm not an explorer or scientist. I'm merely just a house painter. Well, you're the keeper of the penguins, aren't you? Roared the Admiral. Man alive, aren't those penguins the reason for this whole expedition? And who's going to see that they're well and happy if you're not along? Go put on one of those fur suits like the rest of us. We're pulling anchor in a minute. Mama! Shouted Mr. Popper to Mrs. Popper, who had already gone up the gangplank. I'm going too. Admiral Drake says he needs me. Mama, do you mind if I, don't come home for a year or two? Oh, as to that, said Mrs. Popper, I will miss you very much, my dear, but we have money to live on for a few years, and in winter it will be much easier to keep home tidy without a man sitting around all day. I'll be going back to Stillwater. Tomorrow's the day for the meeting of the Ladies' Aid and Missionary Society, and, well, I'll be just in time. So, goodbye, my love, and good luck. Goodbye and good luck, echoed the children. And the penguins, hearing their voices, scuttled up on deck and stood there beside the Admiral and Mr. Popper. And then they solemnly lifted their flippers and waved as the great ship moved slowly down the river toward the sea. So, there's that last little picture. This is the end. All right, so we ended up making a very good choice, letting the birds go with the Admiral, but then at the last second, the Admiral just assumed that he was going with them. And Mrs. Popper says, sure, go. Everything's fine here. She's a brave lady. So he ended up going, and that is the end. So I hope you guys loved it. I thought this was a great book for the cold weather that we're experiencing. So I just hope you guys liked it as much as I did. I will see you guys soon.